I want to shift all the way back and really understand what we mean by racism and what we mean by race, and just go back to the beginning of these things and say, well, what is race? How did it begin? How did a definition? How do we come about this sort of categorization of each other based on a physical trait like skin color? If we're all okay with doing that, if we can all agree that's a good place to start. I don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
That's fine with me.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
race and racism as ideas are inextricably linked, and where they come from specifically is, well, America. Let's be honest. We're talking about racism. We're talking about racism in America, but racism as we know it today was born in America, and by that I mean racism. Race is what people now refer to as a social construct, which basically means that it isn't real, for lack of a better word. But by not real, we mean that it is a social construct, a social term that we use, a category that we use to define each other, that is based on some physical trait that we have that otherwise plays no real part in our lives, other than the way we process sunlight and stuff like that. So what we say is that social constructs are things, for the most part, that are based on a biological reality, but they are not the only way we could categorize ourselves by. We could have decided that we would have a structure, a categorization based on height or hair color or eye color. Any of those things would have been equally viable, except for the fact that when the Constitution, at the time of the invention of race, brown people were already in slavery. So I think people don't really understand that blacks were slaves before race was a thing, at least the race the way we know it now. But the invention of race was a post hoc explanation that was born out of a cognitive dissonance that occurred with the Enlightenment, and with constant defining of the country, that said that all people are equal. So there had to be a way to justify why certain people were not equal. There had to be a sort of, like lack of a better word, there had to be justification for that. And so you see early writings by people like Thomas Jefferson on Notes on the State of Virginia. You see early natural philosophers as part of the American School of Anthropology defining race as this hierarchy and ranking system for the peoples of the world. And so racism is, as we brought, so when we talk about racism, we're usually talking about the influx of power and prejudice, people who have power enforcing their prejudice on the world. But generally, academically, racism refers to the entire system of categorization that we have that places people into ranking and hierarchy based on what their skin color is. And so by ranking and hierarchy, what we mean is that one of these systems, ranking, is saying that you are morally better than people of a different skin color, while hierarchy is saying that you are more capable of them, or vice versa. I always get those two. I get those two confused. So racism, more broadly, is an entire system that we decide people are morally better or just generally more capable based on the color of their skin. And so that's what we would call an ascriptive system. And by ascriptive, the opposite of meritocratic, basically. It means that it's something that is done based on the way you're born and not the way you have achieved in society.
So the necessity to make these definitions as a justification for the disparate treatment of Black and brown people during a time where we're declaring as human beings that all people are created equal. Unpack that a little bit more in the sense of the timing. What time period? You mentioned it was during the Enlightenment. What are some of the key, not only some of the key people, some of the key time frames, time points, what set this in motion? And then more importantly, what catalyzed it and made it such a concrete factor in everything that we do, that before this point, race was almost non-existent. And after that point, race was inseparable from the plight of the average person.
Well, okay, so the Enlightenment is something that pretty much everyone learns about in school when they learn about history. Broadly speaking, it was a philosophical movement that spanned most of Europe, specifically in places like France, Germany, what would become the UK, so specifically Scotland and England, and what would become the United States of America. The basic philosophy, the Enlightenment was basically a rejection of the notion of superstition and rather a superstition controlled world, and specifically the divine right of the king to rule. That's what's really important here. So when we say the Enlightenment, the basic tenets of the Enlightenment that came out of it were the idea of the social contract that people had, that the sovereign, or rather that the government, that the state gained its legitimacy to rule from the acquiescence of the people. That because the people supported the state, that is what allowed the state to rule, not the divine right to rule that kings had normally enjoyed before then. Key people. I mean, this is something that I'm sure people have heard these names before. Adam Smith, basically all the founding fathers, with it Montesquieu, so people like that. People that named it John Locke, Hobbes, not Calvin. Hobbes, not Calvin. People that people that we've heard of before. But the United States, the American Revolution, was the first time that a country was being formed in a constitution and a governing body. I'm sorry, a governance. A government was being formed based on Enlightenment tenets, and so, but prior to this, the need to understand why. Prior to this, the need to understand why bondage did not exist, but as one of the central tenets of the Enlightenment was equality of all man, as a commentary for why the king was no better than your average peasant, why there shouldn't be a feudal system, why there shouldn't be a lordship. It became necessary to examine the people in bondage within the United States. First and foremost, and the way that was tackled was by essentially saying, well, these are not people. So a lot of people don't really understand what the implications of racism were at the time, and that was basically that African slaves were savage. They were not people in the traditional sense of the word, that they needed to be put in bondage. Like, they needed the yoke of the white man, the yoke of the state, to save them from their more savage ways. And I mean, I think we can see the parallels between what was set in stone then as simply a way to justify an economic system that had existed prior to it, that didn't need justification after it was instituted.
So it puts more clearly the dilemma, right? So they're in a dilemma. They're simultaneously trying to establish equality with the king. Therefore, there's no need for a dynastic passage of authority. But then at the same time, they were required to explain why, if they're equal with the king, why is the slave not equal to the master? And this becomes a huge dilemma, because it's not just a moral question, it's an economic question, right? Because if that question was answered similarly to the way the founding fathers answered it with regards to the king, then we could have undermined the entire economic status quo of the period and just destroy the burgeoning American economy. So it was a moral question as well as an economic question. And we started seeing very specific actions that were taken to ensure that people understood that these slaves are not human. Therefore, they could not possibly be equal. We saw not only the language being written by Jefferson in some of his writings, but we also saw the treatment of slaves more barbaric. We saw the way we were portrayed in their writings during the period. We were portrayed as barbaric and as savages and dangerous. And these things became enshrined in our American psyche and American history. And so what I'd like for you to do, Brandon, is take us from this initial onset of African peoples, African slaves are not human. They are savages and they are dangerous, and connect us to that same perception that is held by police officers when they see a black person. Their gut, oftentimes, their instinct is fear, and their instinct is this person is dangerous. Connect those dots for us.